Howdy friends, Craig here. In this episode, we sit around and talk Malifaux 3rd Edition with three of our regular guests, Jamie Varney, Bynum and James Doxey. We talk about how to get better as a player, where the game is now that it's released, and take questions from our listeners. There is amazing advice in this episode. You'll want to listen to it twice. Before we jump in, our friends at Gadzooks Gaming have a sweet offer for all of our US and Canadian listeners. Now, Gadzooks Gaming has always been a big supporter of the Third Floor, as well as Malifaux and a ton of other games like Wild West Exodus, Dark Age, Frostgrave, and Legion. What makes it my favorite online retailer is the customer service and their amazing custom terrain and accessories. They are giving all of our North American listeners free shipping if you spend over $100 and use the promo code Third Floor, spelled out one word, THIRD. Check them out at gadzooksgaming.com. All the details are in the show notes. The promo code is Third Floor. Now on to the episode.
Well, Arcanists have 3 or 4 different units, which are basically a scraggly bloke with a mechanical limb. Why don't we make all of those one model now?
There are several models that are standout models that are the most efficient at what they do for the points that you will see across a number of crews, for sure.
Everything out there feels really good to play right now. So I suspect we'll see plenty of we'll see plenty of more things called broken before we get to a point that anything needs errated. I think right now we're in a really good space.
Everything is broken in Malifaux 3rd Edition, which means nothing is broken really.
And sometimes you will see people who build crews or build interactions that can do something really cute and gimmicky. And hey, that's really pretty, I want to pet it, but it doesn't score points.
There are few things better than stepping away from the screens, unplugging and sitting around a table to do battle with your friends. Every week, Third Floor Wars brings you the latest strategies, tactics, and reviews on board games, card games, and miniature games like Malifaux. If you want useful information on the games you already play, or new insights on great games other people are playing, you are in the right place. Craig and Ray welcome you to the Third Floor and the Tabletop Talk broadcast.
Craig here on the Third Floor. Today, I've asked 3 friends of the show to come on to talk about Malifaux 3rd Edition, basic concepts, strategies, and approaches, and we have a lot to cover. So the guests today are James Doxey, Bynum, and Jamie Varney. Now, all 3 of them have been on the pod before, and if you have not listened to their deep dive episodes, you should go back and check them out. So James, Jamie, welcome to the Third Floor.
Thank you for having us.
Hello.
Awesome.
So, guys, what I want to talk about are some really interesting things. And so we're gonna take some questions from the audience. We're also I'm gonna throw some questions out to you. But the one thing that I want us to really focus on is really kind of where the game is right now. So we're not going to really dig into specific masters and factions or keywords. I just want to get a sense, from all of the play that you guys have gotten all throughout the beta, and now that we're in full release, let's talk about the state of the game. So let's start with you, James. We've got a new edition. Every model changed from 2nd edition. The rules changed from 2nd edition. And even people that have been playing Malifaux for a very long time are running into, crews that they've never really seen before. I mean, if you've played against Jackdaw before, it's not the same as playing against Jackdaw in 3rd. So I want to get an idea from you guys. And with you first, James, when you are about to start a new game, let's say at a first round of a tournament, and there's a new keyword that you haven't played against on the other side, what do you do?
So, I mean, the first thing to understand is what you're bringing, and when you're looking at what you're bringing, you'll hopefully you've played a few games with it already, and you kind of know its strengths and weaknesses. So, what you're looking at is, okay, well, what's good against me, and what do I need to mitigate? So, I'll tend to look at that. So, for example, if Keris is weak to condition removal, you sort of ask, you start asking questions. Do they have any condition removal? You get a sense of, some generic questions to ask. You look at, can it remove scheme markers, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so, I mean, specifically when I come up against a crew I've never seen before, there's a few, quick questions I think I go through with the opponent. I ask what the keyword ability is for the crew that I'm going to be playing against. You can always ask someone, a rough overview of what something does. And I think you can build quite a big picture from something for asking from the card for the master and the totem.
Yeah, and I would just add to that as well. When you're doing that, if you've got familiarity with second edition, most things tend to play down a similar vector. They may do it differently, but Rasputin is still standing off and shooting at you. Lady Justice is still running in with a giant sword. So for a lot of the masters, although the mechanics may have changed, you can still get a good sense of the play style as well. And I second what Jamie says around reading sets of cards.
I think one thing James said is really key there, and it's getting after the concept of, can I categorize the crew? How does this type of crew I'm playing against function? And therefore, going back to knowing your own crew, how do you play against that type of crew, whether it's melee, shooting, control, disruption, etc. Jamie also hit on a key one also, and that's what are those unifying rules or abilities that once you grasp, will apply to almost every model in that crew or in the faction you're playing against in that keyword. And then also, are there any specific things that break or circumvent basic rules of the game that you need to know or understand up front that's going to adjust how you think or how you approach a game?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you guys just said. I think, obviously knowing your own stuff is key, but, and I don't know what you guys have felt, but the one thing that I've noticed now that I've gotten, more than one game under my belt, I've also noticed it's been really helpful that, allure is allure, and, these abilities are the same across all the cards. Have you guys felt that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with that. And for me, part of that goes back into the categorization of models. When you're looking at that crew, if you can put each of their models into buckets, schemer, disruptor, beater, shooter, supporter, or whatever labels you use or whatever buckets you want to put them in, then even if you can't remember everything about it, conceptually you'll understand what the role of that model does and what you can expect from it in terms of the game.
And so here's something that I think really kind of ties to it. And it's something that I figured out, when I first started playing Malifaux, and I actually got some really good coaching on it from some good players a couple years ago. And that's the art of asking the question. So you're, let's say, your fourth activation, it's a key turn, and, you're trying to figure out if I get my Tony out here at the middle of the table, is that going to be a dumb play? And one of the key things that I was taught was, it's very important how you ask the question. So Jamie, it seems kind of generic, but I think you know where I'm headed. How do you ask the question to get the right answers that are going to allow you to make the right decision?
Part of it comes down to what you need to know, but it's going to be that a lot of the questions you're going to need to ask are going to be generic and similar to M2E, be stuff like clarifying how many cards they've got in their hand, clarifying what activated models they've got or what models they've got left to activate, so you're both on the same page with that. Threat ranges is a great one to ask. And when you're asking threat ranges, it's important that you're both on the same page as to whether we're talking about their charge range or their charge plus their engage range. Because if you mix that up and you think you're talking about one and they think you're asking about the other, you can put yourself in a really bad position.
Yeah, and there's probably an underlying, I agree with all that, and there's probably an underlying thing that maybe people who are new to Malifaux need to understand that's probably quite different to some other war games, which is that in Malifaux, it is not my job to know all of your rules backwards. And it's important that to understand that in Malifaux, you're not allowed to obscure information or hide information. If your opponent is asking you something, you have to ask fully, so you have to answer, openly and honestly and fully. So provided you're asking questions which are open of your opponent, like, does this model have any defensive abilities I need to be aware of prior to attacking it? They can't sort of legalese an answer. They can't sort of go, they've got to answer that question, in an open and full way.
Absolutely. And another thing that you can ask and that's useful to ask is if you're relying on a certain ability or you're relying on a certain defensive tech, is to ask, does this model have any way to ignore this? So does this model have any way to do irreducible damage? Does this model have a way to ignore my defensive trigger? Or do you have a way to stop this trigger working? Obviously, it's things like that are going to be specific to your crew and the plan you're putting together, but there's an art to that in asking the right questions without giving away your plan if it might be an activation or two ahead.
And by the same token, if it's something that's not that far in advance and you're not really familiar with that keyword, then just be pretty open about what your objective is. Like in your example of using Tony, if you're putting Tony somewhere and she is going to accomplish something specific, then do you have something that can do X? Or that can stop me from doing something? The more direct you are, sometimes that can help get around some of those things. I think the biggest piece, though, is trying to recognize what their overall approach is, what the overall style that they're going after is, and then that'll help you shape your questions, just like understanding what their crew and its abilities are.
Definitely. And one more thing I'd add to that is that a really, really good thing to get in the practice of doing, which is partly a question and partly a statement and agreement between you and your opponent, is when you're doing something and you're measuring something out, clarify and agree it with your opponent. Cool, I've put this model here. It's within 6 inches of this model, 3 inches of this model, or it's engaging this model or not engaging this model. Clarify that with your opponent. Make sure you're both agreed on it before you move on. Don't just assume.
Yeah, declaring intentions are huge.
Yeah, that's absolutely a point. And you can go quite a long way in declaring intention. So certainly, relatively late in the turn, you can kind of go, look, is there any way you can get to this bomb marker that's down? Or, I don't think there's a way you can get to this bomb marker. Can you confirm that? And those are sorts of things you can do, and it saves you having to, it's a time saver because it saves you having to measure, huge numbers of variables out. If you can both sort of agree a position, it helps the game move on more smoothly across all of you. So asking and having that communication about what is possible at any given moment is vital. Yeah,
and to build off of that, James, and to tie into what you were talking about with threat ranges, Jamie, one of the things that I find myself asking all the time is, I'll say, is there any way for the captain to get here in one activation? Or by the end of this turn. And because what will often happen is you'll talk about the threat range of a model, but you're not aware that there's 3 other models that are going to push them 6 inches first. So I think that, what James and really Steve hinted at too, it's all open information. And this isn't a gotcha game. This is a game where the people making the best decisions are supposed to win the game, not the people that, didn't ask the right questions or didn't know what was on the other person's card.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there, Craig. And to me, some of that also comes down to that kind of standard checklist of questions that you might go through at the start of the game when you're looking at a crew you're not familiar with, of what models break basic rules of the game, what models have movement abilities, what models have obeys. I mean, there's any number of things that can be on your standard checklist, if you will, that you can look at to give you a better understanding of what that crew's capable of. And then that'll help inform your understanding of what they can do in each situation, each turn, and each position by position as you go through the game.
Yeah, and I think, the one last thing that I think on this topic that I'll bring up too is that, pregame is not the only time that you have to ask these questions. So what I find myself doing now in M3E is I'll ask some of those top level high questions like Steve, you were talking about, just to get a feel for it. But, mid game, I'm being very specific and asking questions like, what kind of defensive tech does this person have? What does they ignore? So I completely agree with what everybody said. So guys, we had one of our listeners send in a question. So let's see what Chris had to say.
Do you have a set number of activations that you never want to go below when you're hiring a crew?
So Steve, how about you? Is there a floor that you are not willing to go below when you're talking about how many models you hire?
I really don't have a hard and fast rule. On average, between 7 to 9 models is roughly the composition of the crews I tend to run. This changes based on how a crew functions, what tools it requires, and what the pool requires for me to score. This seems pretty standard with most of my opponents too, and in part kind of drives my choices in the models I take.
And I'm probably going to give quite a different answer, which is I think for me, 8 in any game except for 7 in Reckoning. I think those are probably where my flaws are, which tends to give me enough activations but not being out-activated. I could be in the minority on that.
Yeah, well, let's figure. I want to understand what do you think that's a layover from M2E for you, and you just haven't shook it yet?
No, I think for me it's it's about having the flexibility and having enough models. And I think what I tend to find is if you go super light on models, if you go go lower than 7 in most games, you don't have enough AP to complete the majority of the objectives. And I think there is a level below which you shouldn't go. And I think for me, 7 Reckoning tends to be lower or can be lower because you often need to make sure you're representing a small footprint for those objectives. Plus, having the initiative, having those pass tokens, is actually probably more useful in Reckoning than in some other games. Yeah,
for me, I mean, what you guys have said is correct. But I mean, I generally sit about 9 models in most of my games, and that's purely because I put much less value in soul stones in this edition, which is strange, but I think it's just because I don't get any for free, but that's a different conversation. But I think with the advent of pass tokens, it's definitely less of an issue when you take less models than your opponent, because you do have that ability, especially in the early turns, to pass activations to make sure that you're not being out-activated.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. The one caution I would give is that even with pass tokens, you don't want to be too many activations below your opponent. A pass token may let you hold a key model for a better time to activate it, but it doesn't let you do all the additional things that actions and models will let you do that are often required to score and win the game.
So just out of curiosity, Jamie, what is the lowest number of model counts you've played so far in 3E?
I think 8 is actually the lowest I've played with.
How about you, Steve?
I've played a number with 7. I think I may have had one with 6, but it was a really odd game. Typically, though, even if I'm going that low as 7, that's in one of the rare occasions I'm playing Double Master, which I know our friends across the pond are apt to do.
Yeah, and James, have you even tried going below 8?
Yeah, I've tried. I do dip to 7. Particularly for things like Reckoning. And yeah, it's not impossible. I think as a floor limit, what I'm probably saying is I don't think these sort of super elite crews are the way to go. And I'd certainly be very cautious about going too low on models.
Well, so James, in kind of a similar vein then, if we kind of bucket models to say, 9 stones or higher, and then 7 stones and lower, generally, how many of the larger, stone models are you bringing in, or is it just vary too much?
It varies quite significantly crew to crew. I think it's probably 8 to 10 models at least in my average crew, I would say. But it does vary master to master, and I'm conscious I'm speaking very much from an Arcanist perspective, and it will vary faction to faction as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think I could tell you 2 different masters in the Reza faction, and one of them would have a completely different answer to the other. For Kirai, for example, I like to hire lots of low-cost models and summon big models in. Whereas Molly, I tend to start with bigger models, and then the Forgotten Marshal potentially can bring some smaller ones in.
Yeah, that makes sense, that it would be really not as much personal style as much as keyword dependent.
Yeah.
All right, guys, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a quick break. And when we get back from the break, I want to talk about kind of the general approach to a pool. So when you're about to play a game and you see what the strat and scheme pool is, I want to talk about what goes through your brain at that time. We'll be right back. Howdy friends, Craig here. With 3rd edition Malifaux released, it's time for you to get a new mat with new deployment zones. We've tried every mat in the business, and nobody has better quality and selection than Mats by Mars. They're waterproof and they roll and unroll easily, and they're even wet erase Marco compatible. They offer over 35 designs and let you add M3EO overlays for making deployment and positioning a breeze. Check them out at matsbymars.com. They are offering a sweet discount for our listeners. After you found the perfect mat, use the promo code THIRDFLOOR to get 10% off your entire order. If you really want to support us, in the notes of your order, request that our logo be put in the corner of your mat. It's the only way to make the best mat in the business even cooler. Again, that's Mat by Mars. Use the promo code THIRDFLOOR to get a 10% discount. Details are in the show notes. Okay, so you guys, you're getting ready to sit down and play a casual game. And, a lot of times for tournaments, we get the pools, strats, and schemes beforehand, which I personally love because I'll obsess over a crew adding models and removing models and switching masters for weeks before a tournament starts. But let's just say that you're, casual game, you're across from each other. And Steve, I want to get an idea that once you flip for the strat and the scheme pool, how do you dissect that strat and scheme pool to make the decisions behind, what keywords you're going to bring?
Right. So obviously the starting point, of course, is the strategy. The first thing I'm looking at is how does the strategy change, or how does my crew change based on the deployment zone that's selected as well? For me, the deployment is equally important almost to the strategy itself, because the degree of capability you need in certain areas change considerably as your deployment zones change. The second thing I'm looking at is what pairs well with the strategy, because I'm really looking for efficiency. What can I do with the least amount of effort or activations or actions while I'm doing the other things required to score the strategy, score the other scheme, and shut down my opponent?
Yeah, that's a really good summary of picking your strat. And I think that just goes into then, once you've used that to look at your strat and how you're building everything, the schemes then go from there. If you look at your strat and what you're playing, your schemes can then start to come from, well, where are you going to be on the board? If we're looking at something like plant explosives or corrupted idols, you're wanting to be over the other side of the board, and turf war, to be fair. And that can dictate your schemes that you're wanting to take. Also, what kind of game, if you're playing Reckoning, so do you really want that take prisoner? Do you really want to deliver a message? Are you going to want to keep these models alive to be able to do these schemes?
Yeah, so I would, and I jump off from both of those points, and I think that they're really, they're really good points. I think the key that the deployment and strategy tend to generate is they'll tend to dictate the path of movement around the board. So it'll tend to say, okay, we're playing this game. We're going to need to go broadly from this position to this position, and that'll really inform the movement, which probably informs everything else. And I think the interesting one in that often is Reckoning, where you've got to sometimes figure out how to, are you going to want to stand off or go to the opponent, or how can you force the opponent to come to you?
Yeah, I think James is spot on when he talks about the movement there, because that's going to change drastically for each of these schemes based on the different deployment. And when I'm looking to pair up schemes that work well with a given strategy, like Jamie mentioned, if you're on idols, then things like outflank, where you're already in that position, is a good example. But also the feasibility of a lot of the schemes change drastically based on the changes in deployment zone as well. And I think you've got to consider that aspect of it too. Not just, is this good, a good pair for the strategy, but can I even accomplish this scheme with this type of deployment, and what changes will that force in how I approach the game?
No, absolutely. And, the likes of breakthrough change dramatically depending on the deployment type. Just as you were saying, I think the thing for me as well is looking at whether your schemes sort of contrast or complement your strategy. So if you're going to be playing a strategy that's going to bring you naturally into the center board in conflict, you might want to look for outflank as sort of to contrast that, because you can take models away where they're not necessarily going to be, immediately in conflict with the opponent. Similarly, and sort of contrast what the bulk of the resource is trying to do, kind of sneak around the side and do outflank. Whereas some, in a similar sort of reckoning game where you're going to go in the middle and fight, you may want to deliver a message because you're not confident in killing your opponent's master, but they're going to be in the middle. And kind of figuring out, okay, is this a scheme I'm taking because I can sneak off and do it unchallenged, or is this one I'm taking because I'll be able to achieve it while I'm doing the other things that I'm doing? And that informs what you target in your hiring, to go, okay, well, I'm either going to need a specialist for this, or I can work this into the crew I'm already hiring.
Absolutely. And to go backwards a little bit onto what Steve was talking about, when you're looking at what schemes you can actually achieve, you're going to need to take into consideration the crew that's been put in front of you, because obviously you're picking your schemes once you've revealed your crews. And there's certain things, to give an example of Colette, where actually Colette can spend every moment that she is not activating not on the board. So that takes things out of the game. It takes potentially assassinate out of the game, take prisoner, deliver a message, not take prisoner, sorry, but deliver a message out this pool. And you need to know, if you're picking specific models for things, you need to do your research on those models and ask to see the card and check that you're not actually picking a scheme that you're not going to be able to do.
Yeah, no question about that.
And there's some luck in there as well, isn't there? You can take prisoner on a model that's that should be coming at you, and then it decides to go do something else at random. And it's noticing where you're going to get, where you're taking a risk, on your opponent playing something. For example, take prisoner or vendetta. Just not lining up, and also sort of. You don't necessarily need to take a scheme going, can I get all of these points? But also you can look at, okay, I'm going to take this scheme and I know I'm going to get 1 point for it. And that's enough. So that's something to certainly consider as you're going in and picking your schemes.
The other thing I would add there, and I mentioned it earlier, is the efficiency piece. Sometimes you'll be looking at a pool or examining the schemes, and your crew or the crew that you believe you're going to hire may have the ability to do more than 2 of those, so that you're really picking of what's my preference here. Then really, is there a difference in efficiency between those? Is there a scheme that all you have to do is show up for and you can score, like outflank, where if I'm playing idols, I'm already going to have models in those positions anyway. So just by the nature of being there to do the other things I need to, I can incidentally score the scheme. Or if I'm looking at 2, is there a difference in the amount of effort? Say, for example, search the ruins and harness the ley line. They're both marker-based schemes. You've got to put markers down. The difference is with harness the ley line, it has to be on the center line, and it's 3 markers for the first point, 3 for the second. Whereas search on a given board may provide you more flexibility because it's less markers for the first point, and you've got more options on where you can place them. I'm not saying I'd always take search over harness, but that's just an example of looking at the board, the terrain, the enemy crew, and then saying which of these are more feasible, and then which of these is it more efficient for me to do that allows me to dedicate more actions to accomplishing other things.
So here's a question for you guys. I think at first we tend to think about things when we see a pool. We say, what is the best master to score 8 points in this pool? And as you what the other master is, you start building your crew, thinking about scoring and things like that. James, how often are you thinking about denial? How often are you picking a master for a pool or making crew selections in that pool because it's going to help to deny some of the points?
I think it's a reasonable consideration. It's something, probably it is very much secondary to getting my own points, but a point denied is the same as a point won, right? It's a point of VP difference either way. I think certainly I look at that with choices, particularly in Arcanist. We've got a lot of scheme marker removal in the right objective set. So where you see a very heavy scheme marker pool, it's often interesting to sort of go in there and force that. Similarly, I also tend to look at it from the other way. It's like, well, what points can't I stop? And I'm not afraid to let points go if it's okay, right? I'm not going to be able to stop my opponent getting deliver a message if they've taken it in this game because I've taken a combat master, right? So I think that's another key one. Sort of, what do you fight for and what do you let go, and where can you deny?
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I believe denial is absolutely critical to good play, especially when you're talking about the strategy. because oftentimes if you're able to deny a point of strategy, that's a point that they can't recover. So once you have denied them a point on something like Idols or Turf War, et cetera, where you're taking away a turn that they could score that, you've just capped them at a lower total. With schemes, you can always score later. You can get that first point, turns 2 through 4, and then that last point in the game. But if you can deny strategy points, it's absolutely critical, in my opinion. The one place I would differ with James on the last question is when I'm looking at schemes, I am always playing for 8. Because in my opinion, the way I look at it, if you're selecting a scheme based on just scoring 1 point, then you're automatically handicapping yourself from the beginning, making it that much easier for the opponent to limit you and for them to get the points necessary to either tie or beat you as well.
I think it's completely fair. And I think probably the inflection I would put on it, and you're right, is there are some pools where you can look at an objective set and go, actually, I don't need all 8, or I'm not possibly going to be get all 8. So yeah, as a preference, you're absolutely right there, Steve. And the point around denying strategy is really great. Like you say, capping your opponent with a point they cannot recover is really, really strong.
Well, and James, I don't want to put words in your mouth. And Steve, I'd like to know what your thoughts are on here is, let's say it's a crappy pool, right? And maybe because of your faction, you're not crazy about it. Or maybe once you thought you were going to be in good shape and then you see the other crew, and the choices that were made there, and now you're really not sure. I mean, what's better, Steve, to pick a scheme that you know for a fact you can get a point on, or a scheme that you're feeling like you got about a 40% chance to get both points?
That's really a tough call, and it probably comes down to personal preference. With most things in life, I am a guarantee is worth way more than a promise type of guy. Fortunately, the way they designed M3E, since the pool up front before you select your keyword and crew, and additionally, what master your opponent is playing before you select the remainder of your crew, the rest of your crew, there aren't too many pools out there as drastically different as each individual scheme is, where you're going to have a pool in front of you that you're not going to be able to pick a couple of those schemes and build an appropriate crew that 9 times out of 10 can score those schemes if you dedicate the actions to do it. I think one of the big problems, though, is a lot of times players get in that situation where they lose sight or they lose focus of what the objectives they have to accomplish is. And that's why they end up not scoring something, rather than just their inability to do so. Not always the case, but sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just to build on that, I think obviously all the best laid plans only last until you actually get on the battlefield. But if you're looking at a game and there's not 2 schemes that you're confident you can score both points on, then you need to rewind and go back to crew building because you've done something wrong at the beginning there.
Yeah, and Steve, if I were to pick one thing that prevents me from being a truly top table guy, it is that loss of focus. And I'm getting better at it. And I think I'm playing more to get better at it. And I'm not the only guy out there that this happens to, where I get and it's not losing focus. Like I start thinking about what I'm going to do tomorrow. What'll happen is an interaction will happen that either went away I didn't expect it or came from nowhere for me and throws me off. And I'll forget what the pool is, and I'll just act as a reaction to that.
Well, absolutely, Craig. And Malifaux is a really complex game, which is the beauty of it, with so many variables. And anytime a player is looking at, how do I improve or how do I become more competitive or whatever, there's so many things you can never focus on all of them. So what I would encourage you to do is just in every game, don't try to do it all, but identify the 1 or 2 things in this game up front that you want to remember or work on and that you often tend to forget. Make those the focus of the game, and then continue to focus on those 1 or 2 things until they become second nature, and then pick something else to work on as well.
I think I'm going to set you guys up as kind of my support group. Like my phone of friends.
But I think once you're looking at like the top end of tournament play, actually a massive part of the game is putting the pressure on where your opponent wasn't expecting it and forcing them into having to consider these bad decisions, which throw them off the actual game that they were trying to play. And you put them in a position where actually they're forgetting that, they would move this model here to do this, or they needed to score this point this way. And that's all part of the puzzle that is Malifaux.
Yeah. And I feel like, it's something very unique to Malifaux, because, as someone who's played a good bit of Guild Ball, I didn't have that problem in Guild Ball. And I talk about it as being a problem, but to Steve's point, it's what I love about this game is that there's no paved road to victory in this game. It is activation to activation. Things are changing and you have got to adjust. And it's what makes this game hard for me. And it's why I love it.
I think the other thing you have to do, Craig, also is you've got to work on your English accent, because when you consider 2/3 of your guests on here speak with it and they're the competitive end of the scale, then, maybe that's an indicator of success as well.
Says the guy with the Southern drawl.
In my case, it's all deception. When I show up in a straw hat and overalls, they automatically discount any ability I'm going to have, and that helps me get through.
That's funny. All right. So let's kind of roll into talk a little bit more about competitive play. I think that, in conversations that I've had with all three of you guys, both, on the podcast and offline, a casual game's a casual game, but, competitive play is its own type of thing. And I know from the conversations and I've been having that it seems to me that the trend is pretty well set in the UK not to allow master hiring. And James was telling me a little bit earlier that the Scottish GT isn't going to allow unreleased models on the table. And here in the US, we're not doing Dead Man's Hand here in North Carolina. So, Jamie, kind of what is your thoughts about kind of like these three things. So let's start off with hiring masters and that being allowed in competitive play.
Well, anyone that listened to the Albus episode will know my dislike for hiring masters in competitive play. I think it's a really, really cool mechanic. I think it's nice to allow interesting crews to be played. But personally, I think it is not balanced for competitive play. But more than that, I think it will lead to a really stagnant meta, because if I look at factions, I can point to one, maybe two masters that are sublime second master choices. If I use Reza's for an example, Kirai is an excellent second master, and why would I not take her in so many situations? And that's where the tournaments and the top end of the tournaments then just become Reza crews with the master they declared plus Kirai, or Neverborn crews with the master they declared plus Sarada, etc., etc. And on top of that, it just breaks in my opinion, some of the best things about M3, where we're looking at more themed crews based around keywords, where actually that's not happening because we're hiring a second master who isn't thematic with that crew and doesn't have the synergies, but is just a really strong independent piece. And similarly, when you're looking at declaring a master up front, and that allows you to build to it, well, actually they can throw a complete spanner in the works by putting someone like Colette in, who you need quite a specific toolbox to deal with Colette. And if you don't know she's coming, that's really going to hurt you.
Yeah, and I think when you had the designer episode, Craig, I think the developer whose name I've shockingly forgotten said this was never intended to be a competitive choice.
Yeah, Matt.
There we go. Apologies, Matt. And that's my chance of ever getting a playtest again ruined right there. But no, I think Matt said, this was never designed to be a competitive choice, and I think what we've probably found in probably a dozen or more events in the UK or half a dozen events in the UK is, and for the reasons Jamie outlined, I've messed about with a bit more anarchinist now, and there's just, it tends to be when you're bringing two masters, one of you isn't having fun, and I think that's it doesn't feel fun. And as Jamie says, it seems to stagnate the meta, and it seems to, it seems to have this sort of run counter to the idea in M3 that we're going to have more themed crews.
Yeah, I'll be the voice of disagreement, and yeah, I acknowledge their points that it could be an issue, that there's definitely some combinations and some masters out there that maybe they would be that almost always take choice. But I approach this from the position of, until it's been demonstrated that it's an issue, I want the freedom to do it. I mean, crew hiring is about trade-offs regardless of whether you're hiring second masters, whether you're hiring an elite crew, whether you're hiring, a much larger, less elite crew. I mean, the uniqueness of crew building is part of the game. I mean, in M2E, every crew wasn't the same. Even after Jamie did his thing with Nico prior to the nerf across the pond, you didn't show up to tournaments and every person there wasn't playing Jamie's Nico crew. I think there's enough uniqueness to the game and to the crew building process that, sure, there are some models you're going to see more than others, and that's true whether it's masters or just extremely good, versatile, or maybe even out of keyword hires for certain crews. But I like it as an option. I think it's something new. It's really interesting. My position would be let the community run with it, and then 6 months down the road or a year down the road, you go back and you reevaluate. And if it truly was a problem and counters weren't developed and people didn't figure out how to play against different combinations of masters, then at that point, deal with it. But until it's been demonstrated to be a problem, I don't see the need to take it away at the beginning.
And I would just say, I think I was where you were 3-4 months ago, and having played around with it a bit more and sort of seen it in action on both sides of the table, I think I've come from where you are to where I am now, Steve. And that's, it may be, and I'm very conscious that we probably, the US and the UK do seem to have very different metas. I'm sure, a historian or a psychologist could have a field day with that topic alone. But we do seem to develop as metas in a somewhat different direction. So it may be, maybe you end up in a different place. But I sort of think, and we have quite a hothouse meta because we're in, geographically a lot closer. Potentially we've got there in sort of 3 to 4 months, but I feel like we've given it a good run. And I guess sort of it, I think I'm sort of a bit further down the line on that. The only other point I'll make before I let Jamie come in is, I think there is a danger as well from a narrative perspective, to bring politics into it, that it becomes the only conversation around balance and around competitive play. And I think that's my other worry, is that if we actually, I think it was never designed to be competitive. I think we're far enough in, or we feel far enough in the UK to say, actually, this is, this isn't taking the game in a fun direction at a time when it really needs to be fun and drawing people in. And I'll come back to say, I've never seen, when there's two masters on the board, a new player certainly isn't having fun, and even experienced players, it feels like they're not. And other people have other opinions. I think, it might be best to be locked out at this stage before it ruins anyone's hobby. Although, your mileage will certainly vary.
Yeah, I mean, you covered off most of what I was going to say anyway, but I agree. I feel we've had loads of examples of it, and it is, I guess, because we're closer together as a community, and we seem to have had quite a few events go off where a lot of the key members of the community have been already. But it's, I mean, my ultimate concern from it is at that top end tournament play where it will just be the same options over and over again. And I think those masters that are excellent second master choices are better than any combination of 16 stones of models that you could put into that crew. And it's just going to cause the situation where, as James said, if you are playing at that top end of the tournament, you need to be using that option to compete.
Yeah, and I would just say as well, a huge part of it is the master totem interactions, because often, so I second master hire Mei Feng at 16, I can bring her totem in for 3, which is a significant model, and so I'm actually spending 19 stones on 2 models, a master and a totem which sets the master up very nicely and has condition removal attached to it. So I'm not actually losing anything out there. There are plenty of combinations where you don't actually lose anything, because when you average the master and the totem out, you don't lose activations as a result. And there are some real no-brainer choices out there, which is partly why how I've come to the conclusion I've come to. Although like I say, other people and other metas will come to their own.
Yeah, and I can understand James's point there, and the position that they're taking across the pond. I've done some of the same things myself, like with Karis and Eternal Flame, even though you're not getting a significant model there, by bringing both of those into a Sandeep crew and doing some pretty ugly things with it. I guess my only perspective is, I hate having aspects of a game that are built in that, it seems like time was put into development. Maybe not enough, maybe not, the level of playtesting that would have been required to properly balance dual master hires. But I don't like having aspects of the game that are there, that are really neat, can make some really cool options, and then saying, but hey, you're not allowed to do this. I'd almost rather at that point that they weren't even included in the base rules. And that was kind of my view of Dead Man's Hand. I know that was a bone to the people that already had the models. And there were a number of those models that I already had myself. But I would almost rather just have the devs put their time into making things that I can use instead of using it on things that I'm then not able to play in, any number of games that I play.
Yeah, and I'm normally a dove when it comes to these sorts of things. I'd rather wait and see. So I agree with you there, Steve. I think we've like I say, I feel far enough in to have made that conclusion. With you, with Dead Man's Hand, I think there's an interesting window, which is probably closing fairly rapidly now, where Dead Man's Hand should be allowed just because people have the models. But like you, I would have rather they'd have said, actually, these models are gone for now, and they may come back later. Particularly as, a lot of the models that are gone actually would make perfectly reasonable proxies for something else. I mean, you could always rebase Lilith at 50 mil and call her Nakima. You could always play Ramos as Hoffman in an Arcanist crew. So I don't actually, I think they could have just said, actually, forget Dead Man's Hand, we'll make them appropriate legal proxies for other models, and no one's lost any models. And this is someone who mained Ramos in M2E. Ramos has been my master from first edition to second edition, and I'm making a point of principle. I'm not picking him up in DMH. I've not played him. I've not read his rules. He's not dropping on the table for me. He's on my shelf, waiting for that time where he breaks out of jail and makes a triumphant return.
Yeah, preach for Nico as well, mate. Preach for Nico. But yeah, to just swing back around, I think I don't really like to use them as an example, but if we look at the journey that Age of Sigmar's been on, when actually it first came out and they sort of put two fingers up to balance and just went, people will play the game in a fair way because that's what people want to do, and they let you sort of more or less do anything you want, and that wasn't popular. And actually what they did then was built a set of rules where the game was more restricted for competitive play, but then you had the option when you weren't playing competitively to do these stranger and more off-the-wall things. And actually the game has never been bigger, and it is booming at the moment. And I don't think it would be a bad thing for Malifaux to go, cool, well, actually, this is a cool option and we want people to be able to do it. Is it right for competitive play? No, probably not. So let's not have that in competitive play, because actually we've got so many options across every faction that the need to play around them with the options of second masters and the combinations they bring, I don't feel is necessary at all.
Yeah, and I can agree with that point of view. The one thing I would say is, and obviously I'm not part of the staff. I don't get any input to their process. But if that's the intent, and if that's the approach they're wanting to take, then to me, make a section that says optional, and put that crap in it and, run with it. But just clearly say up front, hey, in the rules, this is optional stuff. If you want to do X, you can do X, and then people know from the beginning, all right, here you go. Especially like new players coming into a game, they're going to read a set of rules, and then that's what they're going to expect when they go to participate in an event or something else. So if you can't get that, if it's not clear and apparent reading the rules that, hey, this is not intended to be part of quote unquote normal gameplay or competitive gameplay, then you're almost creating that kind of false perception up front, would be my only reservation there.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it just comes down to this. I think in gaining grounds, we trust, I guess, where, I mean, my hope for it is that dual masters will be outlawed in gaining grounds. And that's just part of actually when we as the experienced players or the henchmen or wherever you stand in your communities, introducing people to the game and actually saying, cool, well, look, this is a tournament. We were already having to say to them, this is gaining grounds. You're going to need this. This is what we use to supplement tournaments. And then if the rules changes in there, then that's part of that, and that's actually cool. This is the game, and then this is if you're playing the game at tournaments on a competitive level, what you're going to need to do that.
Yeah, and I'm completely good with that approach as well. In spite of my defense of multi-master crews, etc., I don't want anybody to take that wrong. I love the game. I'm happy with the game the way it is. I'll play it, regardless of if gaining grounds only allows you to have one master in it. I just tend to fall in that camp up front of I want the maximum flexibility to play and explore.
So the last little piece, because we talked about Dead Man's Hand a good bit, James, how do you feel about people being allowed to use the beta rules for unreleased models in competitive play, or not being allowed to use unreleased models?
Yeah, I've sort of had this discussion. One of my teammates rang me actually while I was in King's Cross Station in the middle of London on the way back from a work thing. And I had this conversation sort of on a platform with all the people staring at me like I'm a right weirdo. And I guess where I came down on it was I think it makes, what not having unreleased models does is it gates off certain masters, particularly in Guild, and there are masters actually probably or keywords, but in a number of factions that sort of borderline become unplayable without their unreleased stuff. But actually, I can kind of take that or leave that. I think, actually, at a balanced perspective, with or without the unreleased stuff, we're in a good space. I think where it comes down for me is it's what this does to the mood of players who've already got things and already got models, and now half of their crew doesn't work. So it's not the Euripides players who just can't play anything that worries me. It's the various existing masters that are missing very core parts without these unreleased models. So I'm in favour of letting them in, but I totally understand and letting them in not from a balance perspective, but from a player experience and not upsetting the player base at what is a relatively delicate time for the game. That being said, I can respect TOs going the other way.
Yeah, and I kind of fall in the other camp. I do think there are some exceptions there. Like you look at something like Nikema, where her new totem in M3E is an unreleased model, and I can see the need for her to have her totem to be on par with maybe the other masters. My problem stems back to something else, and if I go back for me in terms of my gaming background, 15, 20 years ago as a competitive Warhammer player back then, typically I tended to favor the events that GW ran as opposed to indie events, because I'm the type of person that when I show up to the table, I want to be able to look at the table and understand what the models are based on what I see. And in events that GW ran, you were required to, at least here in the U.S., like their old grand tournaments, you're required to use their models. Models had to represent the appropriate thing. And when you get into areas of allowing people to use unreleased models, then that brings proxies into the equation. And then, sure, it's at the TO's discretion, but I've seen extremes, at either end of that spectrum, where you had to make something that looked the closest to what the actual model would be. Vice, back in the old Warhammer days of seeing sheep armies that were supposed to be X, Y, or Z, and you almost needed an encyclopedia and an abacus just to know what the heck they were playing. And I don't want that. I want to be able to look at the models, know what the model is, not keep a cheat sheet to explain every model you're using that is not the model on the table.
That's totally fair. That's absolutely fair. It's a really good argument. Possibly I've spent way too long alpha testing with Ludo counters glued to tiddlywinks, which we've done a lot of. So I kind of get around that. Once it's on the board, it's a playing piece to me. But I totally get that argument. And like I say, I think it's there are some, like Nikema's totem, there are actually a good number of things that don't work without their unreleased models. But like you say, I can go either way on it. I think it's the bad taste in the mouth of the players, the people like McCabe, people with, there are a number of people who will have basically whole crews of their own models that don't work now without something that's, to be honest, we already know the rules of. And so with an appropriate proxy, we're 99% sure we know what the rules for those models are going to be. I'm in favor of letting people use their toys during this window of release to grow the player base and not offend people unnecessarily. But I totally take Steve's point. Things need to be clear and visible on the tabletop, and people should be playing with appropriate models that look like the thing that they're supposed to be.
Yeah, I actually have swung around and just sort of sit on the fence with this one now. I was really disappointed with the decision at first, because there's loads of toys that I'm excited about using that don't have models released yet. And for me, it was a case of it's that excitement. It's everyone wants to use their new toys. Actually, those of us that have been testing during the betas have proxies already for them and have been looking forward to using them and are ready to go with them. But at the flip side of that, I also know plenty of people that haven't been playing during the betas and have been waiting for the real game. And actually, whilst we could give them the beta rules for all these models, it's not fair to expect them to have to play against models that aren't officially released as well. So from a selfish point of view, as someone who was beta testing, I would love to be able to use my new toys, but I can understand why the decision generally has been made to not allow them.
Yeah, I think James's point about there being a window is pretty good. And I think that we'll have to see what it's like. I mean, for me, I played against a McCabe player recently, and he brought 2 hucksters, which aren't released, but he also brought, and I can't think of the henchman's name, but there's another model that's in that keyword too, LaRue, I think. And it got a little bit confusing, to Steve's point, which is, all right, which one's the huckster? Which one is that? So I think I fall on, if we're going to do it, then we're going to have to be real good about proxies. And I don't know about you guys, but I prefer the proxy to be a non-weird model. So what really screws me up is when you bring, a soulstone miner and try to tell me it's an arachnid spider. That screws me up, as opposed to bringing, a bones model and telling me that's a weird model.
Yeah, and back during the beta, similar to, I believe, what Jamie and James were saying, I know a number of the people I played with, we would do things like put labels on our models that were proxies for other things. And I think that's all well and good when I'm trying something else at the house, when I'm trying a new crew, when I'm trying a new approach, or when I'm, beta testing something that they haven't made yet so I can provide back feedback. But when I go to a tournament, kind of like painting, I want to see models. I want to see the right models. I want them to be painted. I want to have a good overall experience. And anything that can lead to some of those gotcha moments where it's, I didn't realize that was X and it did this because it's some other model, just exacerbates some of those problems in my mind.
No, I agree. All right, gentlemen, let's take a quick break. When we get back from the break, we've got a really good question from one of our listeners, Jacob. It's probably going to kind of tie into the therapy session you guys gave me. He wants to know a little bit about becoming a better player. So we'll be right back. Howdy folks, Craig here. Now if you love gadgets as much as we do, you're going to love the new Third Floor Wars Gadget Bundle from Schooner Labs. Branded with the logo of your favorite podcast, it comes with 2 measuring multi-tools, a compass stepper for those tight and important movements, along with a compact dashboard to track your turn, strat, and scheme scoring along with your soul stones and pass tokens. It is the perfect bundle for anyone who plays Malifaux or just wants to look cool while doing it. The link is in the show notes. Check them out and help support your favorite gaming podcast. Okay, I think that was a really, really good discussion, and I had a pretty firm stance on all 3 of those things, and I'm going to have to think about it some more. The one point before we move on that I thought was very interesting among all of them was James's point. I think it was James's or Jamie's point that by having the second masters there, it might hide some imbalance elsewhere, and could be a distraction. So it'll be very interesting to see how things unfold here over the next several months. But Jacob, one of our listeners, sent in a question, and Jamie, I'd like you to start off.
Hello, Third Floor Wars. This is Jacob from Indianapolis. I first want to give a shout out to everyone in the Malifaux community. I hope everyone is happy and healthy. But here's my question for the expert panel. As of recording this, I have yet to win a single game of Malifaux. So what I want to know is, what are the basics that you think every new player should know to get them over the finishing line for a winning game? Thanks in advance for your answer, guys. Keep up the great work.
Okay. I mean, a lot of it is going to be points mean prizes. So we talked a lot about strats and schemes, but I think going into M3, it's going to be a bit of it's going to be down to attitude as well. I think anyone who was part of the betas can appreciate the rage at playing against the gotcha moments in the new M3E crews. There's a lot of stuff you won't have seen before. There's a lot of stuff that if you don't know it's coming is going to ruin your hobby. But come out swinging, bounce back, play it again and again until you get it, learn it. There is so much to take in. I've played countless games of M3E and I still get surprised by stuff. I still get my toys taken off in turn one and look at the board and go, how did that even happen? And you just need to take a moment, take stock, look at your crew, look at what your opponent did to you and think about the answers you've got to it. But if you're starting fresh and you're in a position where actually you're not winning games or you're not quite getting it yet, pick a keyword, maybe two keywords, but ideally one, quite a flexible keyword. I'd say every faction's got a keyword that is fairly flexible, and learn it. Learn what you can do, learn what your weaknesses are and your strengths are, and that'll enable you to go out and play against a variety of things where you are confident about your crew and you can concentrate then on the game around you, the things that people are doing to you and what you need to do to win.
Yeah, I would add to that as well. I think picking a keyword's really, really key, and sort of focusing on that. And potentially the thing maybe to do is play a game, and if you don't win, kind of look at it, and then see if that same opponent will play again. And kind of just reset the same objectives, the same, two chosen masters, and kind of replay so that you're, so that you sort of give yourself that chance to iterate without a lot of the variables, because there are so many variables in Malifaux that actually resetting a few of those and giving yourself the opportunity to sort of learn from that kind of that repeat. Would be good. Ask your opponents, look, did you see any mistakes I made? Because quite often they're more obvious from the other side of the board. And if all else fails, just find someone worse at Malifaux than you and stomp them.
Nice. So I'd give you 4 points real quick and maybe a bonus. First, to reiterate and expand on Jamie's point, learn your crew and understand the role of each model. Every model should be able to do something every turn that matters. Either scoring, preventing scoring, creating the conditions for an advantageous situation later, but learn your crew and what it does. Second, learn the board. How does the board, the pool, and the terrain dictate how, where, and when events take place, and how can you exploit this to put your opponent in an unfavorable situation or yourself in a favorable situation? That also goes back to the alignment of strategies like we talked about earlier. Third, start looking at the opponent. How does their crew work? What's critical to that crew's success? A model, a turn, a sequence of actions. How do you prevent them from accomplishing that? Fourth, like James said, after each game, go back and look. Did you use each piece as intended? If not, why? What could you have done differently? Why did you fail to score? Was it because you didn't commit actions or your opponent prevented you? And if it was on your opponent, what could you have done to mitigate that? And then for the bonus, find the best player in your area. Find somebody that'll go open toga with you and play with them continually. Get them to talk about what they see that you're doing wrong. Get them to talk about their thought process. how they target prioritize, why they're making the decisions that they will. Not necessarily every turn, every action, every model, but starting to understand and see how people think and approach the game will bring all of that together for you. And then, like we were talking with you earlier, you're not going to be able to do all of it in one game. So in each game, try to focus on one or two specific things and then stay with those until you've mastered those and they become second nature, and then continue to expand the development of your game and your play.
Steve, I think that that last piece of advice, I think is a very big one, at least from my perspective. You and I have talked, and I think you've done a very good job and been very generous in helping me really go in with that mindset. And I go into a game now with a crew, and I've been working Molly hard lately. But when I put McMorning on the table for the first time, I said, my objective. Obviously, I'm going to try to win. Don't get me wrong, but my objective this turn is to really understand how this poison stuff works, and how can I make an effective turn one to get the poison where I need it to be. And I want to understand the mechanics of the poison by the time I'm done with this game, and that's helped me focus a lot.
Yeah, I jump in off that as well. I think that's really great points from Steve and Craig there. And I think they, define what you want as success out of a game as well. So, to your point about poison, Craig, I think, if you're losing every game 4-0, and you may not be, you may be, drawing every game, but sort of figure out, okay, well, what am I going after this game? And it might not be going from sort of losing 4-0. It might be going to, okay, going to 4-2, it sort of look at focusing on an incremental improvement rather than just the win-loss, the final scoreline. I think that's really important.
Yeah, and another thing I do, which is not going to win you a lot of games, but is going to progress your play a lot. I stress test everything, and I use casual games to do this. So I turn up to a game and I'll put a crew on the table that maybe I'm not as familiar with, or the first time I play against a new crew, and I will almost forego points in the game, but I will try and engage every model, try and see the weaknesses of it, see what my crew can do, stress test the situations that they can be in, what different interactions work, what different combos work, and just focus on learning models and learning abilities and combinations rather than trying to score. And then actually when I go into a game that is more important, maybe a tournament game or even just a game where actually you're more comfortable with your crew or your opponent's crew and you think you can compete in it better, and actually you'll be in a much better standpoint to understand the game and take some of that headspace that you need to use to think about all these things because you're more confident with them, and put them into actually how am I winning this game.
And I think Jamie hit on a key point there, and that's when he transitioned from talking about the stress test into applying that to a tournament game, because you've got to focus on the objective. Like the example you gave of McMorning and looking at the poison and what your first turn looks like, what you're trying to accomplish there. It's good to get that familiarity and to establish a rhythm and figure out how this approach works and what you're going to do with it. But don't get distracted by the machine if it doesn't enable the objective of winning. And sometimes you will see people who build crews or build interactions that can do something really cute and gimmicky. And hey, that's really pretty. I want to pet it, but it doesn't score points. And so once you learn the mechanic, make sure the mechanic is building you towards that objective of scoring.
Yeah, no, and thank you for clarifying that, Steve, because that is also it's so easy in this game to get lost in combos, and it's not War Machine where combos win you the game. The game is not that linear, and for me, learning the poison mechanic was not learning that a set turn or anything like that. Like literally, I just wanted to understand when things happen. Like it was like learn the mechanics is probably the best way to put it. But boy, oh boy, it is real easy to get too cute in this game and decide wrongly that the objective of this game is going to be I'm going to get these 4 models to make this one cute thing happen. And that's fine if that's what's fun for you, but don't be surprised if that doesn't turn into a winning strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are some situations where you can build something that's kind of cute and effective. In our group chat the other day, we were talking about the Power Crew, and I'd posted some pictures of that game. I played with Karis and somebody else. So this is a US-centric chat. Sorry, guys. But it was a dual master crew with Karis in there, and I had 12 or 14 power markers out. I think 12 power markers out turn one. And yeah, it was kind of cute. It wasn't the most efficient use of some of my actions, but it was actually really effective too, because in that game we were playing corrupted idols, and there was no way my opponent could get to the idols without going through the powers. But oftentimes it's not the case. Oftentimes we build these machines or we build these boxes where we can do all these cute interactions that don't have any significant overall influence on the game or affect our ability to score. And that's the thing I would caution people against.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important point. I just really wanted to second that and underline that. And you know, I've played against way too many crews that spend, their whole first turn messing about in their deployment zone, gaining focus or doing something else while I'm off scoring points on the rest of the board. And that's, it's something that, to be avoided. And if you're not progressing and spending your AP in the direction of victory, then, then all the cute combos in your deployment zone in the world won't help you.
Yeah, and to build upon that, I think to use a term that you don't often hear in Malifaux, I think tempo is so important in M3, more so than it was in M2E, especially if we look at the rulebook strategies. We've got 3 of those strategies. You're winning those if you are over the other side of the board before your opponent is. And if you're building a convoluted plan that actually, yes, you know what, may be quite cool if it all goes off, and you're losing tempo to it, that's not going to win you the game. You need to be quick off the mark. You need to have a plan and you need to be able to stick to it. And actually, if things get taken out of it, your plan can't fall apart.
Yeah, no, I think that it's that temptation is so strong to want to do that. We've got a good friend of mine, Marcus, that plays here locally. He part of what he loves about the game is coming up with that secret tech combo stuff. And I think he is even starting to realize that, that his love for that is hurting his ability to win. I've noticed in the last couple games that he's played, and one I played with him, that I'm seeing less of him trying to build those Goldberg machines to get that one event to knock off. But Jamie, I want to ask you kind of a similar or along the same vein question. So, you 3 guys have played a lot of Malifaux. You guys were very active in 2. You've been very active all throughout this transition. As we start 3, I'm seeing a lot of new players, new potential players, new people showing up. And I want to kind of get an idea, Jamie, how you handle let's say round 1 in a tournament, so a competitive environment, and you have got somebody who's really maybe has 1 or 2 games under the belt. How do you handle that scenario so that we don't lose them as a player?
Oh, well, if I'm at a tournament, I'm going to crush their hobby, Craig. There's no hold part there.
We know that. That's why I went to you first.
No, I'm joking. So actually, but I think the important thing there is actually, so we need to remember we're in a competitive setting and they're in a competitive setting. So for the respect of both people, you're going to take it seriously. But there are things you can do to make the game more enjoyable. I think starting with crew selection, there are crews in every faction that are absolutely horrific to play against if you don't know what they're going to do to you. Something like Colette, where actually a new player is going to just straight up attack Colette, and that is just absolutely the wrong thing to do. Or something like Brewmaster, where you can get stuck in that disgusting aura of his. And it's just about, you don't have to pick one of those. There's no point stroking your ego by taking something absolutely filthy. Actually take a crew and talk to them throughout the game. explain what things can do. And actually, when they're looking at the board and they've got options, talk them through the options and be honest about it. If we're looking from the point of actually a really experienced player versus a new player, I don't think it's the question of how you're going to win the game doesn't really come into it. It's actually, can we make this a really enjoyable game and a learning experience for both people? And there's better ways to do that. And my main point is going to be around talking the opponent through options and not taking a crew that's going to hit them with some horrible gotcha moments.
And I'd add to that, great points. And I'd add to that, probably take backs, let them, just like let them declare stuff and go, yeah, actually, I'm not sure you want to do that, and here's why. And sort of go, let them kind of, where they've done something obviously, or they're trying to do something that's obviously flawed, that that will just result in disaster. There's no harm in pointing that out, particularly with very new players. I think just not letting them, trying to steer them clear of the massive pitfalls there are in any given game. There's only so much you can do, but I think that's certainly a help.
Yeah, the tournament question's a little more tricky. If a person is playing in a tournament, then you should expect a basic fundamental understanding of the core rules and functions. If it's a one-off game, then it's a whole lot easier a question to answer. And that starts with crew selection, playing something like Jamie said that's a lot more straightforward, maybe even lower on the power curve. Typically, even in a fun game, I don't quote-unquote pull any punches. I'm still going to make what I think are the best decisions turn to turn, because that's what will help teach the player how to play themselves. But also intend, or I also make sure that I ensure they understand how my crew functions, what the tricks are, how they should play against it. And then I want to talk them through their decisions. I'll try to explain why and what I'm doing and encourage them to think through some of the different options available to them when they activate models and help keep them out of traps. This is one of the toughest things to do, I think. I would rather play half a game with a new player and give them a chance to see the full flavor of a game than rush through an entire game that just tables them without giving them an understanding of the possibilities or the things that really makes Malifaux cool and unique. When you put that into a tournament context, it's a little bit different. I'm still going to take that same approach, but there's varying degrees of it as well. I think I can be pretty clear about that without, going overboard, in that you've got to let them in a tournament make some of their own mistakes and make some of their own decisions as well. Because at the end of the day, if you are competing, you've got to be able to make through enough turns for you to score your points as well.
Yeah, and I think to that point in the casual environment, I think where you're playing casual, what I tend to do is I'll take significantly weaker crew and probably choose some optimal schemes, and then sort of play my normal game from there. And that sort of so that you're not obviously pulling punches against the opponent, but you've made those decisions up front that will hamstring you enough to kind of pull the game back towards them. That's much easier done in a casual environment than it is in a competitive environment, because I'm always slightly nervous when an opponent goes, "Oh, I'm new," as happened to me today. And then in a game of corner corrupted idols, they're still playing Zoraida in Gremlins with all the Silurids. There's a limit. There's a limit to how much you can believe your opponent and pull up punches if you don't know them. I think for a casual environment, that's a lot easier. And at tournaments, as Steve said, there's a very definite balance to strike there, but you can still make sure your opponent has fun even when they're, even if the game's not going their way.
Yeah, and I think to build on that and to swing it round to a more casual environment like the other guys have done, I've actually been introducing a couple of people to Malifaux recently, and we've been playing the Henchman Hardcore M3 rules, and those are awesome for introducing new players, because actually what you do by removing masters and some of the other mechanics that Henchman Hardcore has or removes from the game is removes a lot of the gotcha moments. It removes a lot of those synergistic combos, which allows you to focus on actually interactions, how the game works, scoring points, how flipping cards work. If we're talking like a really new player, I can't recommend Henchman Hardcore enough as getting people into it for at least their first sort of handful of games.
Yeah, I think Jamie's spot on there. And in a situation where you know it's a new player, then I also don't hesitate at all to rig the pool, to deliberately pick a strategy, a deployment, and a set of schemes that will let me walk the player through various aspects of the game, and possibly strengths of the crew, keyword, or faction that they have indicated they like or that they want to play, to give them more of a deeper introduction beyond what they may have got previously. Obviously, that's for a casual game. Going back to James's point about opponents in tournaments, my kind of rule of thumb is if they speak with an English accent, then burn their ships, dump their tea in the harbor, and open fire, because it might just be part of their deception.
All right, moving on. We have Chris, a listener. He actually gave us the question about minimum activations. He actually sent in another really good question. So, James, I'd like you to give your thoughts.
Staying on the topic of corrupted idols, how often do you find yourself cheating the initiative? And during the game, do you typically spread your crews out, or do you bunch up to one half of the table?
So I think with corrupted idols, that's probably the strategy where the initiative matters the most, and it is one where, yeah, absolutely, and particularly where you've won the initiative and your opponent sort of passes, then cheating the initiative after you've won to place the markers, something to get in the habit of. Just because you've won doesn't mean you can't cheat. So that's worth considering, but it is one where having the initiative is very vital, I think, in corrupted idols. So yeah, I absolutely cheat that one more. In terms of splitting the crew, I think what you need is to be able to cover the ground, certainly. So yeah, I try to spread up along the line, but there's always a balance there between that kind of spread and sort of being able to be taken out too easily in a particular space.
Yeah, and to build on that, I would say I've had a lot of success in corrupted idols with both ways of doing it, with spreading out and with focusing on one area. But you need to look at your schemes before you make that decision. If you look at your scheme pool and actually you could achieve all of your schemes whilst staying in a 1/3 of the deployment line, then actually you can absolutely build a crew that's going to be able to get you pass tokens or generate pass tokens during the game and afford you the ability to dictate where that corrupted idol marker is going to go, and then dominate one part of the board and just engineer that corrupted idol marker going there. But you're going to need to be able to score your schemes from there as well.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And, in the discussion of splitting versus focusing only on one side, you get 2 idols on the board before you can score. Since you can't score first turn, though you can push the idol over first turn. So you don't have to have all the idols to score, just most. But really, the strategy is only one piece of the puzzle. Equally important, like we talked about earlier, is the deployment with it. Playing idols into standard or wedge doesn't require near the maneuverability or the range of actions or influence that playing into flank or corner requires, just because of the physical space between. And so I think you have to look at those things. Also look at the type of the terrain itself, look at the type of crew you're playing against, and then that'll help you make those decisions as you pair that strategy with the schemes that you selected, much like Jamie indicated already.
Yeah, corrupted idols is a strategy and it's a lot deeper than it initially seems to be. And Jamie, your point about manufacturing where that idol goes, it's not just cheating the initiative that can help decide that. I think your point about pass tokens is one that's very easily overlooked.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, guys, we're going to take another break. And when we get back from this break, we're going to take another question from a listener. And it's going to be focused on really what kind of play styles are more effective. So we'll be right back. Okay. That's really interesting to hear how you guys approach Corrupted Idols. It's a strategy that I think the more you play it, the deeper it gets. And it's got a lot more randomness to it initially when you look at it. And sometimes when you lose a Corrupted Idols game, you're like, well, the marker didn't get where I want. But I thought Jamie really made a good point about focusing on potentially engineering where that is. And that can go beyond just what you cheat. So another one of our listeners, Michael's, got a question that he sent in. And James, I'd like to know what your thoughts are.
Hey, I was wondering for all of the guys, what are your preferred play styles, and what would you believe is the more competitive keyword styles in the meta? As far as like more mobile keywords tend to be stronger, or more very killy crews? What are y'all's preferred ones? What do you normally win with? What do you think would kind of top out the meta? Maybe it'd be the Summoning Master of the factions. Do y'all think that they'd be the better ones? Maybe the Poison Master? Just want to know what y'all's opinions were. Love the podcast.
Well, as an Arcanist, I can be very, very clear that the Poison Master is not. Poison is not a play style that I prefer. But I think for me, and I'm naturally a defensive and evasive player, so I tend to avoid combat and tend to go after my points because it's very easy to spend AP kind of going into the enemy. So I tend to prefer a mobile defensive play style, but that is something that's very much my play style. I think it varies player to player. One thing I will say is I don't see Killy as being a play style. Even almost to a certain extent in Reckoning. I think it's a scale. And one of the things you should do is recognize whether one of you will be the killy crew in any game, depending on who's brought the most combat to the game. So I tend to view one of you will be killing and one of you will be evading. And that's a scale. And depending on crew selection, you'll place yourself somewhere on that scale. And if you're more killy than your opponent, you're the killy crew. And if you're less, then you're the evasive crew. And it's kind of playing towards that for me.
Yeah, I agree. And to counter what James said, I'm actually a really aggressive player. I play a really aggressive play style, and that's not to be confused with killing, although that is generally the way I go. But it's an aggressive positioning game. It's controlling the tempo of play. It's forcing you to make bad decisions, and a lot of crews can get into that. But what will be good for a player will generally come down to what play style they are comfortable with. We've had in the UK people at the top of the game who have been aggressive players, people at the top of the game who have been defensive players, and it's down to you and your style, and you build crews that work with that and are effective in that to score your points and win your games.
Yeah, I agree with that. Though, much like James, I always value mobilities in my crews. As it lets you dictate the terms of the engagement, determine where the action is going to happen. And this is true no matter what kind of crew you're playing. If you want to interact or play an avoidance crew, then mobility can facilitate this. If you want to play more of a kill first, scheme later, a la Guild and M2E, then mobility can let you pick your targets with surgical precision and determine when you're going to attack those. With any type of style or any approach you take, the way I look at it is you want to emphasize that as much as you can and capitalize off of any advantage that you have over your opponent, whether it's mobility, combat power, control, disruption, etc. The more that you can emphasize whatever the advantage your crew has over the other crew, the better you can set up situations or positions throughout the game of relative advantage where you can exploit that capability your crew has or the advantage that you have in order to allow you to execute your game plan, disrupt their crew, and score your points.
Yeah, for sure. And I think I want to emphasize that I think actually any play style can win games of M3 and any play style could be at the top of your meta. But I think if there's one thing we three seem to agree on is that mobility works, whether you're playing that evasive game like James is playing, the positioning game that Steve was talking about, or my aggressive ball positioning play that I'm playing, that mobility is really, really important, especially when you're looking at the strategies and the schemes that we have currently in M3.
Yeah, because I think we've got, 3 strategies now that just primarily focus on movement and then that ability. And one of the reasons I sort of favour mobility over anything, over a lot of play styles is, you don't win a game of Malifaux by flipping cards, and generally movement ability, sort of introducing that variant. So generally movement abilities are easier to get off. They tend to not be opposed, so it tends to give you that freedom to act without your opponent's ability to disrupt it as much, which is vital. So that's one of the reasons I tend to go that way.
Yeah, I agree with that. And the other piece there is that in any of these strategies, even if it's a strategy that doesn't as obviously require maneuver or mobility, the key for me is mobility allows you to pick the time and place of the interactions, not interactions as in the Malifaux, action, but the interactions as in the engagement between your models and theirs. And mobility facilitates that and allows you to pick the time and place where you have the greatest advantage in the exchange, no matter what approach you're playing.
Yeah, I'll do a quick plug for a previous episode. Ray spent a lot of time kind of rating every keyword based off of several factors, including damage output and mobility. So for those of you that haven't listened to the Malifaux Matchmaker episode from several weeks ago, that might be worth listening to. And I am in the same boat you guys are. I think mobility does not only everything you guys talked about, but the other thing mobility does, if you're like me and make mistakes, it allows you to recover easier from mistakes. And I find that to be very, very helpful. I want to talk real quick, gentlemen, about kind of a new mechanic in the game, which is pass tokens. And I don't want to go too deep into this, but I'd be curious to know, for you, James, how often are you thinking about pass tokens and activations when you're building? And I'd also like to get a sense of how you evaluate whether you should be using a pass token to pass an activation or not.
So I tend to look at pass tokens relatively little during build. I think generally I try and fit in what I can fit in and just try to aim inside enough models to do the job to a point we've already talked about. I think in turn, I think when to hold pass tokens and when to use pass tokens is an art that's still developing in M3, but certainly in some game types, particularly in Reckoning and Idols, actually access those pass tokens to what Jamie was talking about earlier is really important. So I think there's something we're all still exploring and getting to grips with.
Yeah, agreed. I think generally it seems to be the case that pass tokens in a non-corrupted idols game are most useful turn one for that ability to keep those activations even. And in the later turns, you generally can't afford, certainly at the start of the turn, to be passing activations. You might find at the end of the turn, if you've got an odd model left and it's not in a position where it's threatened, you can afford to spend a pass token. But it is, as James said, still a learning experience. And actually, there's crews that can manipulate pass tokens in different ways and use them for different things.
Yeah, absolutely. Quality of early activations or actions is one of the big things that determines it for me. And balancing this against the criticality of the initiative, like Jamie mentioned for Corrupted Idols. When I look at it, I try to assess what's the criticality of the activations that are going to occur early in the turn. Are there things I have to be able to react to? Or are there things I have to see occur or situations present before I can activate key models? If not, then I like to hold them to guarantee the choice. But there's not really that easy, a hard and clear rule, as it's going to change based on the individual circumstance of each turn and each action as the game progresses. Often, though, if you're getting pass tokens, unless they're being generated by chaff models, you can't just afford to set back, especially in the later turns, like Jamie said, after turn one, and burn out your own models and give the opponent opponent multiple unopposed activations back to back. I don't play it with a hard and fast rule. I try to look at, if I activate early, can I deny my opponent key actions? I try to balance that against, do I need to hold certain models to later in the turn to answer either key threats or key situations or their ability to score? And then how much greater is my need to dictate or guarantee the initiative next turn, and what that's going to allow me to do both this turn and create the conditions for the next activation on the following turn.
And to just quickly build off what you just said, Steve, I think one of the skills that I'm working on the most, and I'm probably not alone in this, is the ability to correctly assess the threats from activation to activation. And I think we could probably do a whole podcast on that, because that is something that I think is critical for getting better at the game, and that is being able to say, this needs to happen right now, or this can wait till later, and not even talking about passing or not passing, but determining your activation order.
That's the holy grail of Malifaux.
All right. So we've got a really good question from one of our listeners, Alexander. And Steve, I'd be anxious for you to answer, or at least start the conversation.
Hello, Craig. So here is my question. So there's been an effort with the new edition so that people try to not use the same models across all crews. But still, I'm listening to your podcast, and for instance, the Razors seems all to use Archie and Manos. I don't know, you see Soul Miners like any Arcanist crew. So I was wondering whether the new edition was really the death of the Dream Teams. What do you think?
So I don't think the answer is completely clear yet. I do think that we have definitely shifted away from 70 to 80% of each crew per faction being the same or virtually the same for almost every master in the faction. In late second edition especially, there were a number of factions where for a given master's crew, you would have 70 to 80% of the crew might be identical no matter what master they were playing. I don't think the threshold's that high for M3E, but I do think there are some clear picks in each faction, both in terms of versatile models or even out of keyword picks that can mitigate concerns or weaknesses across multiple keywords or provide specific key capabilities that are valued or needed based on what the current pool of strategies and schemes are. While I don't think you're going to see the full all-star or dream team crews, I do think that in each crew, or in each faction rather, there are several models that are standout models that are the most efficient at what they do for the points that you will see across a number of crews for sure.
Yep, I agree with Steve. I think I've heard the term actually used by Steve of super friends, which is where you do have these models that are just excellent choices for their points, but I think you can't look past keyword synergy as well. And I think the addition of keyword abilities is going to help keep that under control, because there is a lot of synergy within keywords, which we didn't have a lot of in M2E. And I think that makes a big difference to how we're going to build our crews. I definitely think we've seen the death of all-star crews, but there will be certain models that you see fairly often, things like Big Brain Bryn in Gremlins or Serena Bowman in Neverborn, because they plug a gap or bring something to a crew that is useful in loads of different situations.
Yeah, and I'll probably echo what the guys have said around that. All very good points. I think the thing for me is there isn't a. What M3E does is it encourages crew building from inside your keyword, so crews are more in theme. The all-star or all-comers list that you saw a lot in M2E was more of a function of kind of game balance and power level of individual things within the faction. So while paying an extra soulstone out of keyword will do that will alleviate that to a certain extent. It will be a function of game balance and having sets of objectives that emphasize very different things. So to kind of encourage players to build different crews in different ways. So I think that's that's probably where we're going to end up. But I think it's much more a function of overall game health. And right now the game looks healthy than it is going to be solved by the one silver bullet of kind of keyword hiring.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point, James. And to follow up on what both you and Jamie have already said, the keyword synergies definitely influenced crew building, but more than anything, it was just the rebalancing of everything, which made almost all the choices much more viable in terms of what they brought to the table, kind of that game health state that James just mentioned. When you look at the choices that are out there now, like the twins and Malifaux, as your questioner mentioned, to me, that's much more like Jamie said, that's much more a case of trends and similar capabilities that are needed for the current set of strategies and schemes. That as you start seeing things like gaining grounds, as you see new strategies, as you see new schemes, there's going to be a shifting process there. But I think it's the natural state of any game that people are going to look within their keyword. They're going to look at the strategy. They're going to look at what are the tools that I need to accomplish the strategy and schemes. And if there is a more efficient or effective way of doing it outside of the keyword, then it's worth paying the tax to do so. And if there's a certain model or series of models in your faction, like maybe Cassandra and Arcanist, or the Soulstone Miners, or the Twins and Rezzers, or whatever model based on what faction you play is, then if it can do it much more efficiently, or even slightly more efficiently than a model in my keyword, and it's a model that I've used enough times that I'm comfortable with how it functions and how I'm going to employ it, then you're always going to see people reach for some of those tools instead of just playing purely in keyword, except for those masters where the synergies are really that important to the crew's operation.
Yeah, I think Steve just hit the nail on the head for me as well there when talking about models people are comfortable with. The models like Archie, as an example that was used, is a really simple to use model who is very good for his soulstone cost. And it's easy when you're learning a new game to take a model you're comfortable with, and you know what it does. It's easy to use and it's good at what it does. And we're still at the very early stages of this game, so it's not surprising that people are taking these good points efficient models quite often while they're still learning what they're doing and getting comfortable with other things and other combos and synergies that they may have in their keywords.
Yeah, and to jump off from Jamie's point there, I found myself I started there were some versatile choices in Arcanist I was taking in every single game as I was kind of getting up to speed, and the more I'm playing, the more I'm finding actually I'm kind of relying on those less and less, and some of that is your ability to kind of how many models can I learn at once? And Malifaux has always been a game of kind of understanding and kind of knowledge. So knowing your own stuff backwards is really helpful. So playing from a smaller pool actually helps you quite a bit. So I'm a big believer in kind of trying to play from a relatively small pool of models, which probably leads me into playing, kind of more models out keyword and more sort of standardized stuff. But as I'm getting more experience with M3, I'm finding myself diversifying more and more. So I expect that's something we'll always see imbalance as we go through, but I expect that to probably die down a bit, as Jamie was saying.
Yeah, I think, bottom line is that it's way too early to make that call. And I think the point that you made, James, is, and Jamie that kicked it off, which is, people are just learning these models, and we're not just learning how to play them so we gravitate to what we know how to play, but we're just learning how to play against them. And who knows, we might have a whole new set of strategies and schemes come Gaining Grounds 2020, which, you could have Archie is great right now in a lot of things, and then suddenly, everything shifts when that thing goes. So I think it's way too early to make a call on that, except for one thing. And Kyle, if you're listening, Matt, if you're listening, turn the volume up. Soulstone Miners are filthy. They need to be nerfed, and something needs to be done about it.
Here, here. And those spiders as well. They're versatile.
You leave my swarms alone.
Thank you, Jamie.
By nerfed, Craig means an increase in willpower and maybe an extra point of movement.
I'm gonna mute both James and Steve. Jamie's with me on this, and that just needs to happen.
Absolutely.
A discount if you take them in pairs.
All right. But actually, that kind of leads me into something that I kind of want to use to wrap things up, guys. And so we'll start with you, Steve. I want you to pull out your crystal ball. There's things that probably concern you right now, but if you were to guess, what you could see as potential real problems a year from now. So M3 is a year old, and any game is going to have problems by the end of its first year. What do you predict could be the potential problems that we're facing with third edition a year from now?
This is a point I'd really like to use a pass token, but I'll go ahead and dive in here. There's really not too much I'm concerned about. If there's anything, it would probably be stagnation, and I'll take the roundabout way of getting there. The reason I'm not too concerned is I was a late adopter of Malifaux anyway, and I had a chance to see in second edition how they worked the errata, where they would do point tweaks, where they would come back and relook at things that there was a significant perception were out of balance and needed to be retooled. So from the big perspective, I'm less concerned about individual models or the power level of individual models, because those are easy fixes for them to tweak a point here and there or reword something or change an ability on a model. To either boost it or slightly lower it as required. The bigger issue for me is where the beta ended, there were still a few of the crews that felt like they needed help to me, that weren't as finely tuned or refined or on balance with some of the other crews. I think across each faction, you can point out a number of crews that there's a lot of synergy. The models are really polished. Everything works well together. They may have some weaknesses, but that's fine. It's part of the paper, rock, scissors aspect of the game as you look at those and you look to exploit them and how to mitigate them, et cetera. But there were definitely a couple crews that had some pretty significant changes at different points through the playtest process that when we ended still felt like they needed a lot of help. When I look at a keyword, and, I play every faction except Bayou, which is probably part of the reason I don't talk with an English accent and wind up at the top end of the table. But when I look at all these different factions, and then I look at, a particular faction, I'll just use Red Chapel as an example, and I pick up Seamus and I'm looking through his crew, and over and over and over for every strategy that's in the book, almost regardless of the scheme pool, I find myself building crews where almost 50% of the models are either out of keyword or versatile because the models in that keyword just don't stack up to the other choices, even if I'm paying the keyword tax. So with that being the case, and I know I went on way too long and I need to give the other guys a chance here, I think within a few of the factions, there is some risk of a little bit of stagnation because there are a few of the crews that I would almost say need a little bit of a touch-up and a little bit of a polishing on to bring them up to the level that the other crews are so that you can put them into that paper, rock, scissors rotation where everything's viable in the right pool against the right opponent in the right game.
So, yeah, and I echo a lot of what Steve said. I think probably his concern probably mirrors mine and probably leads me into a hope. So my kind of concern probably is around the number of models already in existence, and I was sort of quite surprised with third edition where it didn't take the opportunity to not dead man hand more stuff, but kind of go, well, Arcanists have 3 or 4 different units, which are basically a scraggly bloke with a mechanical limb. Why don't we make all of those one model now? I'm kind of surprised they didn't do that. And so it leaves a lot of stuff in the range and a lot of stuff on shelves. And I know that they'd take some action to kind of reduce that, but there's still a lot of stuff out there. And my kind of hope linked to sort of Steve's concern is that what we'd do going forward is what I'd like to see is rather than them sort of add loads and loads of new stuff, I'd like them to maybe every year take 2 masters or 2 keywords in each faction and kind of redo them completely as an approach. So, maybe pick the 2 best, if one's overpowered, bring it down that way. If something's underpowered in each faction, bring it up. And kind of if they were to kind of on an annual basis kind of cycle that way rather than just adding, and resculpt the models, do new stuff at that point to kind of drive that angle of it. I'd rather see that than we all get an extra master, in a year or two. I think that'd be my view on it, but I'm sure there are other commercial imperatives, but that'd probably be my concern and my hope.
Yeah, I have to agree. I don't think there's a lot of room for that many new models. And I think there was some chat about it during the beta, but I think a much better way to go is alternate playstyles and alternate crew boxes of models we already have, rather than just loads of new models that add loads of new options that you can take with existing stuff. But I think I'm going to throw it out there because I've got to, and I'm hanging my hat on it, that I genuinely think if it's not something that's dealt with in Gaining Grounds, that dual masters will be a thing that is a problem in a year's time, but we will see. Also, I just want to say that I think there are models that it's really easy to say are ahead of the curve at the moment, but we're still in the really, really early stages of it. Even in the UK, where we've had quite a few events and seen some things that are perceived as better than others, and there is a lot of calling things broken and saying things are better than others, but actually, ultimately, the meta is still developing. We haven't seen everything that everyone can do. Not everyone knows their crew the same way that they did before, or has found all the different things that everything can do. And it's really, really early to make a call on that. There is inevitably going to be stuff that is better than other things. As long as we end in a overall balanced place, that's good. I mean, you only need to look at the level of playtesting done in the beta to see that some things were tested more than others. And I think that comes across when you look at rules that were adjusted in some factions and then left the same in others, maybe where they weren't play tested as heavily for a similar rule. But ultimately, it's going to come down to we won't know just yet. It's easy to cry broken at the moment the first time you play something, but I would implore everyone to go and play it another couple of times before you make a judgment call on it, because it is M3, if nothing else, is full of gotcha moments and situations where if you don't know what's coming at you, it's going to hurt you.
Yeah, and I kind of, to Jamie's point, I think around everything kind of looks broken. I think that's probably a statement of where the balance is, and to kind of my kind of proof in the pudding with that is always looking at one of my teammates who sort of every week it seems, I found this and it's really, really broken. And he takes it to an event and maybe it doesn't do as well as he'd hoped. And he's like, right, I'm on to the next thing. And, so every week he's got something else that's utterly mad. I think he's 3 different factions in now, sort of leaping to the next thing that looks really good. And, everything out there feels really good to play right now. So I suspect we'll see, we'll see plenty of, we'll see plenty of more things called broken before we get to a point that anything needs errated. I think right now we're in a really good space.
And I think that's the beauty of the game. And it goes back to that overall sense of balance. Like both of you guys have said, there's a number of things people see that the first time they see it, they just have a crazy reaction to. But that's just part of the balance, because, one crew may have a problem with this, whereas for another crew, there's no problem at all. I think the game's in a really good spot. I do acknowledge the concern from across the pond about the dual masters, and we'll see what Gaining Grounds brings. But I highly encourage people, like everyone on here has said, don't let one interaction with a model or something the first time you've seen it lead you to make an overall judgment about the game. For everything out there, no matter how tough that crew seems, no matter how crazy that ability seems. Like, for example, Masaki's ability to just cram Severe's back into her deck, or big brain Bryn's deck manipulation, etc. For every one of those tricks out there, your own faction, your own crew has your own trick that you can exploit and you can use to counter theirs just as well.
Yeah, I mean, an analogy I keep using in our quote unquote big M3E group for the UK is that everything is broken in Malifaux 3rd edition, which means nothing is broken really. And it is just that. Everything is a lot more extreme than it was in M2E. There are abilities that if you put it in M2E, it would be straight up the most broken thing in the game. But actually, in the context of M3E, that's not the case, because for by your side in Rezzers, you've got Masaki popping out of shadow markers, or the soulstone miners unburying and generating soulstones. There's just different things in different factions, and it's easy to look at things and go, whoa, that is broken. That is the most broken thing that needs adjusting. And actually, everything is just more extreme. It's a different game, but still feels like Malifaux.
Yep, I could not agree more. And it even for those of us that were playing all through beta, I will argue that we're still figuring out our own factions, let alone whether other factions are underpowered or overpowered. And I love that phrasing, Jamie, because the first time you go up against any master in 3E, they are just going to appear to be absolutely bonkers. But the second or third time you play them, you'll have a different perspective on it. So it does. Even though I joke about nerfing some Arcanist models, I think time will tell. And if anybody's listening and knows how to deal with those two models, just shoot me a email. It'll make me really happy.
Well, if you want to deal with anything in the game, according to the UK group, that you need to just start playing 10 Thunders, because they are #untested filth. a little call out for Alex Drake there.
That's funny. Well, if anybody's going to find the filth, it'll be Alex, right?
You're right.
That's great. Well, gentlemen, I do appreciate it. Just so everybody knows, we've got episodes coming out from Steve. Has got some Yan Lo love coming out in a couple weeks, and then Jamie, we've got Karai episode coming out soon, and I've got to corner James to get another episode, a deep dive out of him. Gentlemen, I want to do this again. I think that there was a lot covered here. For those of you that are listening, I highly recommend listening to this twice, because I really think that there was a lot of really interesting things covered that you may have missed the first time. Yeah, guys, I appreciate it. I hope that we'll be talking again soon. So last but not least, Steve, if people want to get some more information out of you, do you have anything you want to plug?
Actually, I do. I don't have my own podcast, tournament, or event, but you always ask your guests that, and I never have anything to say. So I thought about it in advance this time, and I wanted to hat tip my plug to someone else's event. If you haven't been there before, I highly recommend the Las Vegas Open out in Las Vegas. Chrissy, Derek, and Doug run an amazing event with lots of great people. It's normally a 3-day event, 3 days of awesome gaming that has a day of fun events like Henchman Hardcore, team events, Enforcer Brawls, etc., and then a 2-day more serious gaming tournament. This year it was an M2E farewell on Saturday and an M3 beta on Sunday. I think next year, January, February timeframe, Friday's a fun day, and then a 2-day grand tournament event on Saturday and Sunday. Plus, it's Vegas, so it doesn't get any better than that.
Yeah, Steve, that's on my list. I had a chance to actually meet Chrissy at CCM last year, and we made very fast friends. And I'm a big fan of Vegas, so I've got to make it out there. How about you, Jamie? Do you have a podcast that you're someday going to record and want to plug?
I'm not going to shoot myself in the foot by plugging a podcast that may or may not ever be recorded. Although if we're going to record it, it's going to be after Scottish GT, because that is next weekend. So wait and see. That might be coming. But I will go ahead and plug the UK Nationals, which is coming up in November. We normally see quite a big international crowd come over for that. It's the sign-ups are building all the time. It's looking like it's going to be quite a big event. It can host over 100 people. It's got the potential to be massive. But if anyone is thinking of coming, get signed up to it, because the UK Nationals is a grueling 7 rounds of Malifaux. It is an awesome event. It is the highlight of the Malifaux calendar in the UK.
I'll argue, Jamie, at least until we at Third Floor Wars has a chance to get this Masters thing fully up and running this year. I'll argue, I think it's the coolest event period in the world for Malifaux. I think that the way you guys build up to it, the way it's covered. I'm excited just to watch the results round by round, and very envious of you guys.
Yeah, and we've started an age of live streaming stuff now as well. I know the Scottish guys live stream stuff, and I'm sure they will be for Nationals again. So there will be coverage. It's just awesome seeing that many people. I don't know if it still is, but it certainly has been in the past the biggest Malifaux event in the world. It's just such an atmosphere.
How about you, James?
So no events of my own to plug, but I'm going to plug my local FLGS. They've just moved to new, larger premises that are brilliant. They're air conditioned, which is amazing in the UK. Just plug for Leodis Games in Leeds. They're if you're looking to buy Malifaux in the UK, they're brilliant. And if you're in the Leeds area, you want to go play, they're great. And I'd also just add a plug for Heartfaux, which is in the aid of British Heart Foundation. It's happening in August, at the end of August in York. If you can make it along to that, that's really good. And, all in aid of a really good cause.
All right. Well, guys, I do appreciate it. And like I said, everybody stay tuned on the podcast, because we're going to be seeing episodes where these guys share even more knowledge. And then I'm going to talk them into doing another one of these roundtables, because I thought this was excellent. Take care, everybody.
Cheers now.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to rate and write a review on this podcast so we can find more people almost as cool as you are. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube by searching for Third Floor Wars. That's THIRD. We'll catch you next time on the Third